Thank you, everyone. See that a few people are starting to trickle in. So as we get started, or before we get started, I wanted to first announce a little disclaimer that we are recording this event. This event is being recorded. So please feel free to take that into account as you participate in this discussion. And so with that more or less out of the way, I want to introduce myself. My name is David Tamez. I'm an assistant research professor at the Institute for Information Sciences here at KU. I'm also the a managing director of the Center for Cybersocial Dynamics, a center that is executive directed by Professor John Simmons of the philosophy department. And so briefly, I want to sort of give an account or give it a sense of what this event is. So today's event is part of a general series that brings together researchers from a wide array of academic perspectives to delve deep into the complex ethical challenges that arise in our increasingly digitized or digitalized society. In the spirit of a similarly titled Research Rising initiative, namely Securing Our Worlds, we will expand on the idea of addressing the various issues raised by emerging technologies across digital, social, and physical landscapes, confronting topics like social norms regarding privacy, security, and human technology relationships. This series will examine their effects on the individual as well as the environment and our social institutions. Today's event, which is the first event of the series, is Global Digital Worlds. So this discussion will center questions about the use and application of digital technologies, including those of global access to data, economic implications of access, and the resulting inequities within information security. Before I introduce our moderator and our panel, I would like to thank a few people who helped bring this all together. First and foremost, this series would not be possible without the persistence and dedication of Emily Ryan and the Commons. This series, while in terms of substance, falls under the Institution for Information Sciences and the Center for Cybersocial Dynamics. It is also very much a product of our collaboration with the Commons. Second, I would like to thank I2S and the Center for Cybersocial Dynamics for sponsoring this series and for having supported my efforts supported these efforts and bringing it all to life. Finally, I would like to thank our co-sponsors for today's event, the Center for East Asian Studies, the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and the Department of African and African American Studies. In addition to these departments, there have been a number of other departments that helped us spread the word about today's event. And maybe future collaborators along in the future events of the series. So I want to thank everyone that helped contribute to today's event. With that, I now want to introduce our panel. Moderating today's discussion is Korede Ajibona. Korede is a PhD student in philosophy and has been part of a number of initiatives in Nigeria providing digital literacy programs and platforms for young scholars. And then joining Korede as part of the panel, we have with us Jack Zhang, who is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Kansas. His dissertation examined when and why economically interdependent countries use military versus economic coercion in foreign policy disputes. Next, we have Dr. Rebecca Johnston, who is a postdoctoral researcher under Center for East, under CREASE, and also part of the Research Rising initiative with I2S and the Center for Cybersocial Dynamics. Rebecca is a historian of Soviet culture and power with an interdisciplinary focus on disinformation in the Russian and broader post-Soviet space. Her current writing project examines historical narrative and contemporary Russian cinema as a vehicle for state-sponsored disinformation. And hopefully, joining us in a matter of minutes is also Dr. James Yékú, who's an assistant professor of African and African American Studies at the University of Kansas, specializing in African literary and culture studies and digital humanities research. His recent work, The Algorithmic Age of Personality, explores how algorithmic politics play significant roles in online literary controversies and cancel culture campaigns. Please join me in giving and welcoming our panels and Korede as our moderator. With that, I'll hand it over to Korede.
Thank you so much, David. Hello, everyone. We can get started. So, well, welcome to this awesome conversation. I hope we have a great time. So I think we can get started. Who wants to go first to give us their presentation? Jack, do you want to go first? Okay.
Sure, sounds good. All right, thank you so much, David and Emily, for including me in this series. So I'm also speaking on behalf of the Center for East Asian Studies, where I serve as the associate director. Really delighted to host, to be part of this event and contribute to this series, because we at CEAS, the theme for this year's programming is the digital age. And for those in the audience and watching later, I'd really encourage everyone to check out fantastic film series that CEAS faculty have put together for the month of October. 2 will be on campus, 2 will be in the Lawrence Library, exploring different facets of life in the digital age. So check that out. I think as the talk quickly progresses, it'll quickly become evident that I know very little about ethics or about digital things. I direct a thing called the Trade War Lab, and I study U.S.-China economic competition for the most part. But the more I thought about the prompt that we were given, right, the more I think there are lessons that we can draw from the U.S.-China tech war, especially on the hardware and the policy side, that is pretty important to answering the central question of ethics as I see it, which is, right, what are the standards of right and wrong? And the big takeaway that I want to, I guess, make in my brief remarks is that it really depends, right? How you think about this question really depends on how you define right or wrong for whom. Or for political scientists, right, we think about levels of analysis, right? Because the right policy, as I will try to illustrate, right, at the national level, will have different impacts on groups and will have very different impacts on individuals nested within sort of those countries, given the nature of globalization and the kind of digital media that is so essential to the global economy today. So I think there are pretty interesting angles that we can tease apart from some insights from what I work on the U.S.-China trade war and tech war. This gentleman here, this clown, his name is Peter Navarro, was one of the driving forces behind the U.S.-China tech war. Most of us in the China field don't really think very highly of him because he is the author of books like Death by China that are published in non-peer-reviewed presses and nonetheless sell very well on Amazon. He's holding up at a press conference in DC here, a table of economic grievances that supposedly motivated the U.S. Initiation of a trade and tech war vis-a-vis China. And as we'll see, technology plays a really central role here, right? And as much as Mr. Navarro is a fringe figure, there's an emerging bipartisan consensus within the United States on the need to decouple, right, the U.S.-China economic relationship and to limit or have restrictions on the free flow of goods, technology, information, investment, and so forth. Right. And you know, as we're all looking forward to the VP debate later, we know that the two political parties in the United States don't agree on very much these days. But on the issue of China and the right approach, you know, towards China, there's remarkable sort of consensus and actually continuity from the Trump administration to the current Biden administration. Without going too much into sort of a history, right, a slice of, you know, the part of what happened was tariffs and the trade war, which I won't talk about here, but another really large part of the beginning of this decoupling narrative and the policies to try to reduce economic interdependence is motivated by technology and especially sort of the security externalities, right? The unintended sort of consequences of having, you know, using certain technology versus others. And one of the opening salvos in this sort of escalating fight is the ban, Huawei's sort of addition to what's called the entities list, which essentially bans it from receiving high-tech exports from companies in the United States like Qualcomm and so forth. And was a major initiative by the Trump administration beginning in 2018, and a number of countries, as you can see sort of in the map shown here in green are the countries that by 2020 had banned Huawei. 6 then more, I think, have followed in the EU since, but by no means, right, like not all the countries where Huawei is sort of operating are subject to these bans, and the nonetheless sort of it triggered, right, a sort of a response and sort of an escalation of policies to reduce, you know, China's access to technologies and exposure to Chinese technologies, and vice versa, sort of efforts in indigenous innovation on that side. These efforts come in 2 main flavors. One is export controls to restrict what are considered dual-use technology. So dual-use technology are technologies that may have civilian sort of uses, but also military applications, right? One of the, I think, defining characteristics of digital sort of technology and the dominance or the degree of interconnectivity that we have is that there are more dual-use technology than ever, right? The same kinds of chips that go into a weapon system could be used in appliances. You know, the same things that enable connectivity and social networking could enable espionage and so forth. These kinds of concerns, right, have led to, since 2018, when Huawei was added to the entities list, a proliferation of the use of these export controls, and now thousands of, over 1,000 companies, Chinese companies, are added to these lists and denied access to US technology. And the other flip side of this, for anyone who's a Gen Z sort of audience, right, are the controls on imports or investments by Chinese technology companies. TikTok is the ongoing sort of saga that we'll see, you know, what happens with this presidential election, right? Efforts to ban it at various levels of government. Another case is efforts to try to prevent the investment and exports by CATL, which is a big battery maker, right? And so I want to use one example that I'm familiar with on the import sort of side to illustrate the point that I want to try to make about the difficulty of trying to think through the ethics of these policies, right? So to my fellow panelists, right, who may be familiar with drone brands, which of these two is a national security risk? The Octavian Galaxy drone, priced at $15,000, or the DJI Maverick drone, priced at $750 at your nearest Costco?
I would guess the cheaper one.
Is the cheaper one. So DJI Maverick is a Chinese company based in Shenzhen. They're the dominant sort of consumer drone maker in the world, and they sell these pretty cheap, really popular drones with hobbyists and actually a bunch of government agencies as well. Altaven is a drone company based here in the United States in Florida, and has lobbied heavily for DJI Maverick to be either banned or face sort of high levels of tariffs on the basis that it is a national security risk, right? But of course, note the price differences, right, and how this has this question, right? It's like, well, it's a Chinese company, and we're worried that, you know, it's connected to the internet, it has cameras, and so of course we can never be sure sort of what the company is going to do with that data. So goes the narrative that Altavian sort of propounds, right? But the question is not so straightforward, as a bill right now is going through Congress and trying to ban DJI from being used in the United States. There's parallel bills that are like it, including one here in Kansas. And the political debate around this is really interesting. So the groups that have spoken out against the ban of DJI include police sort of unions, which use a bunch of these drones, right, to do sort of police work, and the Department of the Interior, which already is subject to sort of a ban. They had to switch out all of their China-made drones, and they claim that, right, their capacity to do controlled burns and monitor forest fires have decreased as a result, right? Same budget, right? If you're not going to increase the police budget or the interior budget, you're going to buy fewer drones, right, with the same amount of money. And so there are these unintended sort of consequences, right, and creates kind of an ethical dilemma at the group level, right? Are these groups, right, right in sort of asserting their right to buy these drones, their benefits to national security as opposed to sort of their risks, right? And you know, it goes down to the level of the individual, right, as well, right, in terms of consumers sort of as a whole are facing, you know, fewer choices and higher prices across a number, right? Drones are just one of the technologies that's being caught in this sort of mix. And I don't pretend to have any easy sort of answers here. It's a really, I think, important ethical question for policymakers to grapple with, is how to weigh, right, the appropriate sort of responses to concerns about sort of national security risks and how it should be applied, right? And then the potential sort of consequences of you know, denying and forbidding these kinds of technologies. So again, don't have answers there, just kind of opening a question. And these are the kinds of questions that my lab, the Trade War Lab, is trying to tackle. We're a social science lab dedicated to a dual mission. The first is to try to understand the impact of U.S.-China trade war on heartland communities from a bottom-up, data-driven, and firm-centric approach. And the second is to do policy-relevant academic research and by teams of undergraduate and graduate students. So it's what we do and how we sort of do it. We, you know, the sort of the work is interesting kind of questions, I think, for the U.S.-China trade war at the interdisciplinary sort of boundaries between East Asian studies, political science and law, and economics and business. You know, hopefully the kinds of data that we generate and ability to sort of capture costs to, you know, the benefits, I think, have been clearly sort of articulated. I don't want to be you know, naive and assert that there are no sort of concerns or national security risks, right? But I think the interesting question is how to balance, right, appropriately sort of dealing with you know, dealing with the risks and national security sort of challenges of economic interdependence, right, with the benefits to groups within countries and to individuals. I want to close by apologizing for not probably talking about what I was brought on to the panel to talk about. There's a lot involving China and sort of ethics and digital things that I don't happen to work on, like censorship, for example, right, or the export of surveillance technology and so forth. There's a lot of really good stuff in this area, but I do the trade war, so I hope that this was interesting. Thank you.
I'm happy to go next, since I just got totally owned on that drone question. And then I also want to say I'm very excited for that talk next week because those commercials about, well, they had like cows, and the cows were narrating about how they didn't want to be, they were like speaking Chinese, and they didn't narrating how they didn't want to be bought by China. Yeah, those were, then I think it was one of the gubernatorial elections, maybe in Missouri.
That is
It was absolutely
fascinating.
wild. So
I'll have to check that out.
Oh, you haven't seen it? Oh, okay, I'll try to find a copy and send it to you because they were absolutely wild. So thank you so much, David and Emily, for the invitation and for facilitating and organizing this entire event. It's great to have the opportunity to speak on like a little particular line of inquiry that I'm working right now on. That's kind of like a subset of my current research. So I thought that I would just talk briefly about what I do in general, and then this kind of particular little line of inquiry that I think will be relevant to our overall topic. So my current position here at KU, which is a joint position between CREASE, Center for Russian, East European, Eurasian Studies, and the Center for Cybersocial Dynamics, I look very in particular at the sort of how Russia incorporates culture and history into how it conducts information warfare. And I look at that specifically at how it conducts information warfare that's directed towards its own population, so domestically. So we hear very commonly in the news about the information warfare that Russia aims outwards, especially toward the United States, and especially in regards to the US presidential election that's coming up. But I look more at what the Russian government is trying to do on a domestic level to kind of create an information environment within Russia domestically, kind of an alternative reality, if you would, that one way or another, in many different ways, facilitates, they hope, military success in the war in Ukraine. And the way that I do that is I look at cultural production. Russian either state-sponsored cultural production or cultural production that the Russian government is able to co-opt and use for its own purposes. So what is cultural production? There's an example of cultural production on this introductory screen I have right here. This is a screen cap from a music video that was created and posted on a sort of youth-oriented project, a social media account from Kursk, which is the area of Russia that is currently experiencing partial Ukrainian occupation. And the music video, it was this youth project that the kind of story behind the song is that this family that you see here is cowering from Ukrainian attack. And there are other scenes that show sort of the Russian soldiers that are, protecting this family, as it were. So culture production, broadly. So anything that you can think of in terms of, traditional creative arts, visual art, literature, music, dance, cinema, video games, to kind of more modern media like music videos like this. Video games would also be very modern. And then also the institutions that surround them. So theaters, museums, parks, arts and educational institutions, as well as, very importantly for our purposes, the local and federal agencies that fund and control them and promote their activities, including through social media. So the work in progress actually that David mentioned in the introduction happily is out there and exists in the world. This is the kind of screen cap cover. And I wanted to just introduce this little excerpt from the introduction that our editors wrote, because it kind of explains why I and our group more broadly in this edited volume look at cultural production. And our basic premise is that it's useful to use, in the Russian case and in case of other authoritarian regimes around the world, cultural production as open source intelligence, as OSINT. So you've probably heard about OSINT, especially regarding the war in Ukraine, but more broadly as just intelligence that doesn't require you to have a security clearance. Completely publicly available information, commonly referred to in the news as aerial footage from satellites, from drone photography that shows troop movements and locations and kind of more operational, military operational information like that. An argument is that we should also look at cultural production as OSINT, because as one of our editors put it here, I think very elegantly, it helps to, this towards the end of this quotation here, dispel the threadbare shroud of unpredictability and strategic acumen behind which authoritarian regimes strive to hide. So we try to look at this production to basically help to intune regime intent. And considering that the war in Ukraine is continuing, unabated with no end in sight, we argue that this is, one more tool that we should be using, that we have at our disposal. Especially considering that, when you're talking about regime intent, it's a lot easier to kind of manifest your goals in fictional cultural production, right? Like in a movie or in a music video, than it might be to do so on the battlefield. So that's our kind of methodological premise. So specifically, just as kind of examples of what we hope to learn through this approach, insight into long-term Russian state objectives. Like I said, they're easier to enact through culture than reality. Understanding this informational environment that I talked about, in which the Russian government and Russian citizens currently exist, and very specifically, and kind of most importantly, perhaps, to try to gain insight into the prospects for how likely would Russia agree to and then follow through on a peace settlement with Ukraine. So the just as kind of some visual examples of the kind of cultural production I'm talking about, because it's not great to talk about culture without showing you something. There's sort of all sorts of forms of engagement, and from viewing to creating, that I'm talking about here in terms of what can be looked at as OSINT. So there's everything from movies and the kind of like large scale productions that need a production company behind them, either that's a book publishing company or a music venue. But then there's also content that is really only possible thanks to the advent of digital media. So TikTok style videos that people can create themselves and then upload or submit to contests, right? So this advent of creating videos of yourself, or even drawing contests, for children, depending on the age of the viewer here. This can all be submitted and kind of distributed and showcased through state social media accounts. So as a kind of example of the line of inquiry that I mentioned I wanted to look at very specifically here today, just the brief couple minutes left here, there is a lawsuit that the U.S. Department of Justice announced at the beginning of last month against a number of Russian entities, including this entity called ANO Dialogue. And the lawsuit accused them of election interference. And it was a huge story because you'll probably recall it involved Russian infiltration of some U.S. right-wing media outlets, that the media outlets claimed that they had no idea that these were Russian influence agents that were feeding them content. So one of those organizations, this ANO Dialogue, I want to talk about kind of specifically what they're doing in Russia domestically. So we know it's very clear kind of what they're doing in the United States, thanks to this lawsuit and a lot of investigative reporting on that. But what are they doing in Russia? Their website is very open and very transparent about what they're doing. So there is about $68 million from the Russian state budget allocated to create what they're calling regional management centers. And the idea is that they employ, and they have about 2,500 employees, according to an investigative report put out last spring, that are intended to create content, digital content, for local government entities. So if you can imagine, the city of Lawrence state government wants to let people know about road closures and road construction when that's going to be done. But then they also want to distribute some information about how you should feel about cultural issues, about ideological issues, about anything else sort of going on in the world that their federal government in the United States feels important. That's the kind of level of, really micro level, local level content that these centers are meant to create. So as an example of one, in Chechnya, this opened within the past year, and there's 17 employees. Chechnya is a republic within Russia, and the prime minister of Chechnya on the right here, Muslim Hushiev, is very transparently explaining that the social media environment that we exist in right now just is too cluttered with disinformation and misinformation, and this regional center that we're going to have in Chechnya is going to communicate clear information that you can rely on. And he's also clear that it's not going to just be about these local issues about road closures, but it's going to be specifically about important cultural and religious value-oriented information. So essentially, these centers, very well-funded centers, are intended to kind of stand as an arbiter of truth among the morass of information on the internet. Will people actually adhere to, sign up to follow and believe this content is a whole other question. And likely very mixed to negative, I would say. But this is kind of a micro look at what the Russian government is trying to do on a very local level in terms of controlling the informational environment through social media. And to be clear, these accounts, they're creating informational content, but also this cultural content as well that I stated above. So in terms of ethics, I think that there's a lot of sort of ethical implications in a general sense, but maybe we can discuss all of that more in the Q&A. So I guess I'll stop there. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Rebecca, for highlighting how Russia is conducting disinformation operation. So we have Professor James Yékú.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank
So
you.
you can start.
Yep. Thank you so much, Korede, and I'd like to thank David and Emily for the invitation to be part of this very interesting discussion. I'm sorry, I don't have slides. For some reason, I thought this event was tomorrow and came down with the flu, so I don't have prepared slides. My voice might be a bit croaky. I hope you just forgive me. I'll read from my prepared slides, my prepared notes. Hopefully it adds something useful to what Jack and Rebecca have very nicely shared with us. So my topic is ambivalent digitality and the stickiness of algorithms. And I have to say, unlike Rebecca and Jack, who seem to be on the policy side of things, I'm a literary scholar, so this is for me theorizing, the digital space in the context of the ethical. So I come to digital and social media research from the viewpoint of ambivalence. As most people have come to discover, there's as much to love in the torrents of internet memes and TikTok videos we encounter daily, as there's as much to be suspicious about the back-end uses of our data by the owners of the digital platforms and spaces we inhabit. I've written previously that social media platforms, for example, are rife with hierarchies and hegemonic tensions, as capitalists' value is the primal logic of the participatory web's ontological claims to connective relations. In our era of artificial intelligence, I believe the dominant narratives of digital media persistently focus on our vulnerability to algorithmic violence and the dystopic promise of a machinic apocalypse that is soon to visit the earth. From the initial frenzied celebration of social media and its democratizing affordances, to recent complaints about its capacity for misinformation and performative activism, to threats to delete Facebook after every report of a data breach or privacy violation, our narratives of digital media appear to be in a constant flux. The pandemic era, for example, we mainly explored digital media for enabling the continuation of life and labor. And in the years after the pandemic, we continue to deal with Zoom fatigue and the simultaneous paradox of being both connected and alienated. And also the realization that a new generation of students would rather have a machinic body do their thinking for them. My point is that ambivalence has always defined technologies and the narratives we produce concerning them. And my sense of an ambivalent digitality is therefore this idea that digital tools and culture can both amplify and depoliticize. In other words, they enable us, and they also extract from us at the same time. But the real ethical dilemma, as I see it, is that we inhabit platforms designed to give an illusion of agency over our digital lives and subjectivities. Whereas in the real sense of things, platforms like Tinder and TikTok, as well as Facebook and Instagram, are technically configured on sticky algorithms whose fundamental essence is to have us stuck on the platform. Rather than find love on Tinder, we stay forever looking for it and swiping endlessly in its all-consuming capture of our sensorium. Rather than stay connected with friends, we stay forever on Facebook, hooked by its seductive promises to offer more connections. And this is not just the proverbial structural modulation of our agency. I think it's the exact ontology of platform culture. So the stickiness of algorithms, as I described this process of being digitally stuck on digital media, is an ethical question. The platforms and the profit-driven algorithms that power them exist as pillars of the attention economy that commodify us and our leisure time. To be a participant in platform culture is to be a part of an extractivist system. Sarah Ahmed in A Fear of Emotions associates with stickiness as designing an affective value. Stickiness, she writes, then, quote, is about what objects do to other objects. It involves a transference of affects, but it's a relation of doing in which there is not a distinction between passive or active, even though the stickiness of one object might come before the stickiness of the other, such that the other seems to cling to it, end of quote. I'm reading social media platforms here as a product of the stickiness of algorithms, which connects to the adhesive power of the screen media that glues people to social media and its outrage networks and attention economy. And I'll come back to outrage culture, which is essentially the theme of my forthcoming book on African literature and cancel culture. In the cultural politics of emotions, Ahmed describes the accumulation of affective value as involving two processes, namely the production of stickiness and the surfacing from which it is affected as, quote, a contact between bodies, object, and science, end of quote. Sticky algorithms can then be explained as what effectively sticks users to digital objects and adheres them to the performativity of digitized experiences and the tension it accumulates online. Stickiness in algorithmic systems explain how the design of social media is intended to capture people's attention, get them stuck to media science and the politics and controversies embedded in them, and also arrange user experiences into profits for the corporate owners of the platforms. Stickiness online is also about holding things together, holding us captive to digital objects and the surfaces that produce affect. It is in this sense that cancel culture, something like cancel culture, can be understood as a mud-slinging business that benefits big tech while keeping everyday digital subjects stuck to screens and platforms. Specifically, the stickiness of algorithms, as the ways in which algorithms stick us to social media, entails a contact between bodies and the affectivity of digital publics and the outrage produced in social networks. In a post to explain how Instagram's technology functions and how it impacts the experiences that people have across the app, Adam Mosseri, writing for Instagram some years ago, describes how multiple algorithms, rather than a singular algorithm, essentially control different parts of the platform, including the app's feed, posts, explore, or reuse. The Instagram algorithms harvest thousands of signals And this simply means users' information, posts, and preferences, and then utilize these to personalize content that stick people to the app. In other words, people become stuck to Instagram content because the app's algorithms are created to both set in motion and optimize such a behavior. This strategy of creating content derives from the information Instagram collects about a post, information about the person who posted it, the activity, as well as their history of interacting with others. If digital platforms, therefore, are inherently constituted by stickiness, then questions of ethics in terms of privacy violation, data vesting, and the like constitute important ethical questions that remain with us. And I hope we can come back to this during the Q&A. So to conclude these brief remarks, my meditation on social media and outrage economics in recent years means that I'm thinking in recent times about cancel culture discourses in online literary commentaries on African literary experiences and tests. But I think outrage culture itself stems from this algorithmic permutation of user agency. So for example, as outrage elicits clicks online, clicks in turn produce engagements, and engagements produce capital for the corporate owners of social media. This makes it possible to have our experiences becoming an affordance that can be recruited very easily for capital. I'm not suggesting that humans have no agency over machinic systems or over their means of consuming content online. Am I positing any binary relations between humans and algorithms that efface what I believe is a complex intermingling of both? Rather, and this is a view from science and tech studies, I think a co-productionist dialectical relationship pervades the workings of algorithms trained by human actors on our data, and which in turn shape and influence what activities humans perform online. An example of this may be found in a Twitter dialog box that prompts users to read stories before retweeting it. Although these kinds of prompts are less frequently encountered in the Elon Musk Twitter era, the algorithms involved in that action seek to associate user experience to broader questions about epistemic flows and the nature of truth and reality online. But because people have power to subvert technical systems, it is also the case that not every Twitter user submits to these machinic prompts, and others like them on social media platforms more broadly. The fact that auxiliary data like our Facebook likes have to be trained by humans to predict information about user behavior online is itself an essential indicator of human participation in computational environment. So my point basically is to say that there's really no need to, enact a binary between humans and algorithms, although we know that these algorithms are, of course, designed to extract different forms of profit from us, even as social media companies promise a reward mechanism as the natural habitat for our social media engagement. As Nick Saver writes in Computing Tests, algorithms are never simply unaccompanied machines. Humans are central to the operations and the ways in which they produce, and shape cultural taste and minutes. In other words, algorithmic systems are socio-technical words populated by people who make choices and whose motivations and ideas about the world actually change how algorithms work. To wrap up, I think the point is just to think about how the sociology of the algorithm in the context of African literary studies enabled me to think about ethical questions about the platforms we inhabit, especially as platforms that monetize our digital subjectivities. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yékú. You've done a fantastic job of walking us through how algorithms are affecting our lives, highlighting how it does through the literary perspective. I think we have come to the end of our presentations. We'll take questions. So for the question and answer, you can just signify and I will give you the opportunity to speak. But I'll start out with asking couple of questions to our audience, couple of questions to our panelists, so we can get started. So if you can kindly signify, I would be able to know that you have a question. So my first question is to Jack. You've highlighted how the US-China trade war is going over technology, and I think you've showed your stance on the position of like the trade embargo as it is, it's not legitimate, or there's no reason for it, if I get you right. So, but my particular question is, you've highlighted how the US, it's happening in the US, but how is it affecting the global world? Because China and the United States are big players in the tech industry. So how is the US-China trade war affecting the global supply of digital technologies?
Thank you for that question. This is not an area that I have looked too deeply into, but my sense is that, my research shows pretty clearly that the US and China, or better yet, the people within the US and people and companies within the US and China are big losers, both losers from the trade war. By comparison, I think actually the rest of the world benefits so long as they can stay out and not have to pick a side, right? Remember my map that I was showing, sort of, how many countries, follow the US, in some cases led the US in banning Huawei. It's actually fewer than I think the Trump administration hoped for and anticipated, right? A bunch of countries, including allies, developed countries, right, are refusing to switch over kit, and pretty much no developing country, I'm not sure if I'm aware of any, that have said like, no, we're not gonna, we think that the US arguments about the kind of the security threats and the dominance of Huawei and the 5G sort of hardware infrastructure, right, is so worrying that we're not gonna, use them if they are the best sort of priced producer, right? And so that means that I think, if you were one of these countries that's using, you can continue to use sort of, use Huawei and benefit from other, right, like continued sort of trade and investment for, from the US. And so I think the consumers and businesses in those countries have, in some ways, better options, right? They're not forced to choose a product they would otherwise not choose because of these concerns about national security, right? At the aggregate level. That's where my current view is on this stuff.
Thank you so much. So just as a follow-up question, you've explained how the US-China trade war is affecting the global south, the global world. I think countries have reason to, patronize China because it might be cheaper, it might be easier to access. They can patronize anyone they want. But then we also know, like, there's a lot of conversation around what China is doing is kind of like trying to steal data from countries, also engage in information, cyber espionage. So can you speak to that? Do you think the whole idea about digital colonialism as what China is doing? Do you think that is?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I don't know enough to make an informed kind of statement on digital, colonialism or not, right? Because I think this is again where the level of analysis and aggregation sort of matters. I don't think that Chinese multinational companies, especially the private ones, behave in a way or are motivated by different sets of motives than other capitalist technology companies from other places, right? And so if that is the case, then I think it's incumbent on governments to, everywhere, right, including here in the US, to come up with sensible regulations for controls over, data privacy, for how AI is going to be regulated. And the concern that I see increasingly is that efforts to try to establish global, common sort of standards, even conversations to try to establish the basis of those standards, are increasingly difficult, and I fear in the future going to be impossible because of this fragmentation, the decoupling that is happening, right? Where you'll have a Chinese sort of ecosystem that operates by one set of rules and a US ecosystem that operates by another set of rules, and that'll actually make it, I think, harder and harm the interests of citizens sort of everywhere. So I think there's definitely those risks, right? I'm trying to minimize, right, the existence of cyber espionage and companies hoovering up data and not compensating sort of people for it. I question, I guess, the premise that there's something uniquely sinister because it's Chinese companies that are doing it, rather than the fact that, right, without sort of laws to the contrary, right, companies are gonna take advantage of these things and kind of engage in these practices.
Okay, thank you so much. So I think I'll just ask my next question. So Rebecca, you've talked about how Russia is conducting its information warfare. Is there any pushback from within Russia about what the Russian government is doing? Because they are using cultural artifacts, they are using the culture to try and convince people, to disinform people. Is there any pushback from the local citizens from Russia?
Yeah, that's a really important question. So there is, in multiple different ways, and depending on the medium of the content that they're pushing back on, right? So for some of these larger scale productions, like films that are, for example, funded by either the official Ministry of Culture of the Russian Federation, or the Ministry of Defense now has its own film production company, and they'll create these movies that have very undisguised narratives about Ukrainians or about Russia's own military history. That there's like a clear, patriotic line, a clear line promoting military, enlistment, or even something as sinister as there's a movie called The Witness that came out last year that basically argues that the notorious massacre by Russian soldiers of civilians in Bucha, Ukraine, was actually perpetuated by Ukrainians. You will see, like, on the IMDb page for that movie, it has like 1 star out of 10, and there's like all these comments from people who are like verified, all over the world, but like including within Russia, that this is just a complete, piece of garbage, essentially. Not even a good movie for, but like aside from the fact that it has this like sinister, false narrative in it. It's so then in terms of the kind of more local content meant for more, smaller scale viewing, like that music video that I had the first screenshot of, that stuff, people are more likely to just ignore, and it's like easy enough because despite the fact that the Russian government has like a very clear hold on news media in that information space, they do not, in any sense of the word, have like any modicum of control over the kind of social media that people consume. There's still way too much choice there, and they are not good enough at kind of instituting technical barriers to getting people to access this stuff. So that's what people more likely just ignore. But what else was I going to say? So the problem though with assessing reception right now, specifically in regards to the war, is that the penalties for speaking out against the war, and that could mean anything from saying that Russia needs to end the war to simply that the war exists, can land you in jail. So it is very, very dangerous for Russians to make public statements along those lines. There was a person that was interviewed by a journalistic outfit called RVRL, who was just sentenced to 5 years in a penal colony, I believe. He had one sentence, and then it was essentially made worse from and no different action on his part, just based on the same interview that he did for this media outlet, saying that that the war was wrong on Russia's part. So that has to be we kind of have to take that in consideration when we think generally about Russian attitude towards this war, including their responses to surveys about the war. Most people want to ignore it. The key thing to watch is attitudes towards if there is a national mobilization, because the people currently on the battlefield who are signed up for the Russian military are either contract soldiers or they have some kind of voluntary or partially voluntary enlistment, and there is not yet a mandatory, draft, as it were. And so that's why so much of this media is actually intended to encourage enlistment on a voluntary basis, because the Russian government seems very cognizant of the fact that a mandatory draft will provoke a lot of latent negative sentiment towards the war and towards the government that is currently illegal to be publicly expressed anyway.
Okay, thank you so much. So just to follow up, how is this information operation seeping out of Russia? Because we've seen stories of like Russia trying to use disinformation or spread information to bring fighters from outside of Russia, because they are losing fighters at an alarming rate, and they need more people to fight for them. How are they using this information outside of Russia to the rest of the world to draw in support for the war they are prosecuting Ukraine?
Yeah, they're very creative. So I would encourage anybody to look at that suit that the U.S. Department of Justice brought at the beginning of September, because they outlined some of the kind of specific media strategies that the Russian government's used. And it involves, like infiltration of U.S. domestic media, as it turns out, and then also this kind of trick where they pretend to be a legitimate, respected news outlet through having a very similar URL, but then producing their own content. There's also an initiative that the Kremlin has been trying to promote, kind of framing Russia as an alternative civilizational concept to the United States and to the kind of what's framed in Russia as the decadent, woke West. And encouraging people to move to Russia who want to escape what they refer to as wokeism, like in the kind of alt-right sense of the word here. So there's it's kind of an open joke among Russia watchers is, what's going to happen to those people who move over there and take them up on that offer? Will they be enlisted or not eventually? So those are just a couple of examples, but it's pretty elaborate in a different variety of ways. So leave it at that.
Okay, thank you for Professor Yékú. My question is, could you talk more about your idea of algorithmic violence? You mentioned that, but I would like you to buttress more. What does it mean for an algorithm to be violent? Or
well, thanks for that, Korede. I don't think that phrase is necessarily mine, but I mean, the whole idea of algorithmic violence is this, technical and, if you like, discursive rupture, profiting of digital subjectivities online. It's like you're thinking about the harm, if you like, that is done to people just by the fact of their being online through systems of algorithms, through machinic and algorithmic assemblages. And for me, it's just a way to signpost how platform capitalism conduces all of us. And I know that sounds pessimistic and really dark, but I think it's what it is. Like I said, to be part of platform capitalism is to be inherently in a space in which we are vulnerable to the insidious workings of, the back end technical protocols of this invasive, machinic form we all use every day. So basically, I'm thinking of algorithmic violence in that light, the harm that's done to people just by the virtue of their being users of the internet. But of course, that's just one aspect of the story. That is why I start by the notion of ambivalence, because that's not all there is to digital cultures, to digital media. Like I said, it enables things, and I'm not the one to stay on just the negatives only, just the violence. There are many other things one could also focus on.
okay, thank you. And also, could you give us a clear example of how algorithms are being used in Africa. Rebecca has spoken about how it's happening in Russia. Russia is using cultural production to support its war, the war it's conducting in Ukraine. Jack has talked about, the US-China trade war. So maybe you could talk about Africa specifically and what is going on, so we get another a third opinion.
So I mean, I would, in the context of the African side of things, I would be more interested in, say, something like artificial intelligence rather than algorithms. And by artificial intelligence, I'm basically thinking about the lack of regulatory frameworks, for example, in many African countries. And that for me is actually important. I was going to focus my talk this evening on that alone, because I think that's probably more practical beyond cultural productions, like kind of stuff I think Rebecca and I are interested in. Beyond cultural productions, this is, real issues concerning how, how the lack of governance for, say, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and all of these things can be unethically, can be a question of, ethics. In the African context, to give one example, the African Union in July eventually adopted some kind of regulatory strategy for AI. And I think that is something to be proud of, although they basically come late to the game. As of August this year, just 2-3 months ago, 7 countries on the continent had adopted any, governance or regulatory framework for AI. And I think that's worrisome, right? So those are the more practical policy end of things that would interest me normally. Although I'm not an expert in that area, I follow the debates, but I think it's a question of the ethical for us not to have algorithmic systems that are not regulated, artificial intelligence platforms that have no regulations in the context of, the African digital experience. Without necessarily, having these conversations in the context of Africa, we continue to, unwittingly promote this notion of the continent as an anti-technological space. And of course, it's not.
Okay. Thank you so much for sharing insights on what is going on in Africa with digital technologies. So just final question, we've already run out of time, but I thought there's a question I could ask, like all panelists could speak to. So now we've talked about the different scenarios of how these technologies are going on. We've talked about the Russian case, the US-China trade war, what is going on in Africa. So how do we get the equitable framework for digital technologies to be adopted across the world? Because, it seems the US is fighting for its place in the world. China is doing the same. Russia is conducting information warfare. So how does the rest of the world, or how does the world benefit from the development of digital technologies? So anybody from the panel can speak to that. What is the strategy the world needs to adopt? I think of quite recently, one of the US offices put forward the digital solidarity framework, but how real is that for the world?
I can take a quick stab at this,
Okay.
right? I think it depends on sort of the principles of who you're making policy for, and I think we need, at least in the great power competition sort of realm, increasingly sort of dehumanizing, right? To me, the US-China competition frame is dehumanizing, because it's like, if you have a problem with these policies, you're unpatriotic, right? And that is not a productive way, I think, to arriving at good, sensible sort of policy. So whatever the policies, I don't think there's a consistent sort of strategy that different countries can all agree on, because they have different interests, right? They have different occupied sort of different levels of on these supply chains and so forth. But I think one common principle, if we can arrive at, is we should have policies that are good for people. It seems like straightforward and obvious, but increasingly that's not how, right? The more high level and abstract we're talking about, of like, how do we win a tech war, for example, we're not talking about how the impact of the technology is on the people that live in a particular sort of country. And so I would advocate for sort of a humanistic approach to thinking about the best ways to regulate and coordinate on this stuff.
Okay, thank you so much, Jack. So does any of our James and Rebecca, do you also want to speak?
Yeah, I would echo Jack's statement about a humanistic approach. And I guess the only thing that I could really say concretely in regards to your question is the example of Russia as being capable of ignoring and working around any possible framework, or kind of guidelines or restraints that could possibly be set up. They've pretty much made significant headway to closing their social media environment. So Instagram, Facebook, foreign social media companies are largely banned. People can get around that by using VPNs, but when you're just talking about your day-to-day internet user, people don't necessarily want to go through that trouble. Just having the additional barrier of another thing to click in almost every kind of digital access sense is a pretty significant barrier, right? And then they've made their own social media networks that they can control domestically. So even if you have a company that is in a country subject to, that actually follows through on ensuring that legislation is adhered to, that there is regulation on, active regulation on, their Russian kind of reliance on their own domestic social media networks that are domestically controlled is able to kind of control for that. So I think that it would certainly be an unenviable task to try to implement, not only come up with, but implement the kind of framework that you're talking about, I'm afraid. Not that that's a super hopeful note to end on, but that's I think unfortunately what the Russian experience shows us so far.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Just to add something very briefly, I think the EU's GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, is an excellent framework that's been replicated in many pockets of the world. And for me, it's something that is absolutely critical, especially just because it emphasizes the need for human protection, at least to a large extent. And, that insistence on human dignity, just, the idea of a collective communal watch over what belongs to all of us, rather than an obsessive privileging of capital. That for me is really important to achieve some kind of, ethical world with regard to the digital. Although again, we know that there are scholars many leftist scholars will think ideas of ethics are political. So the question you ask itself can be problematic from that perspective. It's not necessarily a perspective I endorse, but I think it's good to know that, so that we are, well, the short answer is the regulatory frameworks people have spoken about are really important. And I think we should be insisting more on those kind of things, especially since they emphasize human dignity.
Okay, thank you so much, James. So do we have final words? Does anyone have any final words to round up?
Just to thank David and Emily for inviting us to be part of this. I've really had a great time getting to learn from Jack and Rebecca, and look forward to being in conversation in some other spaces.
Okay, thank you so much, Rebecca. Thank you, James, and thank you, Jack, for an awesome presentation. You've really shown us what is going on with the world of digital technology, starting from the US-China war to Russia, and even back to Africa, and the minority world. And I think that is the point of having this kind of conversations, for us to see what is going on across the world and how strategies that can come into place to be designed. And I think what I think Jack and Rebecca and even James has emphasized, like, these strategies may not be the same, but at least we recognize that we live in a global world and there's some solutions that will align.
Yeah. Well, after Korede thanked our panelists, I want to thank Korede for doing a very masterful job of moderating this discussion, and asking just really terrific questions to give our audience a sense of some of the subject, some introductory subject, introductory attention to the subject matter. Obviously, a lot is going to be left on this table with just in the time frame that we had, given the limitation. And I want to thank the panelists for at least giving us a sense of just some of the issues that are involved in the global use of these emerging technologies. Obviously, so if you're still in the audience, if you kept with us this long, feel free to keep track of the research and other events that our panelists are going to be part of this semester or this year, this academic year. A number of departments have, as they're sort of thinking about their events, have as a subject of some of these events, AI and these digital spaces. So there will be other sort of events similar to this across the campus. So please keep track of those. And Korede himself is, I think, in the middle of developing another sort of workshop, specifically looking at the use of emerging technologies in Africa. With that, I want to thank everyone for being part of this conversation. I want to thank Emily in the Commons for helping putting this together, and also our co-sponsors. With that, thank you all for this wonderful night and this wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, y'all. It was really interesting.
Thank you. Yes, really enjoyed it. Thanks for moderating. Good night.